I'm particularly delighted for today's book talk because it's an opportunity to see Nina and hear from Nina. I've known Nina. We've crossed paths since when was Australia? Was that 2015 or 2014?
I want to say early 2016, like
Early
January maybe,
2016.
or 2015.
You're right. That's right. January 20. Yeah. So the two of us study similar objects in similar ways. And what that means in practice is there was this time that I flew out to Australia to observe a network of groups, MoveOn.org, and its peer organizations around the world. They were having a big international meeting, and I flew out to watch it. And Nina was the other person watching it because she is a like-minded and methodologically similar scholar who had gotten interested in these same groups, but from a different angle. Nina's an international relations scholar. I'm some kind of some kind of internet politics, American politics guy. And the two of us got to spend a week sort of sharing notes on these fascinating groups that we were seeing. And we got to see each other at events like that over the next few years. Sorry, you can all probably hear a 2-year-old in the background. There's not a lot I can do about that, just release him. But we got to see each other at similar events and sort of become friends and colleagues over the course of that. And then as I ended up getting waylaid on different things, Nina kept on going in further depth with these groups, studying them at a level of sophistication that I only wished I could. That resulted in this book, Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Age. I am a huge fan of this book. And Nina's here today to talk to us about it. So I'm going to hand it over to her. She's going to share some of the highlights, and then the two of us are going to talk about these topics.
Thanks so much, Dave. And it's such a pleasure to share the research with you and your colleagues, partly because Dave's work, as he mentioned, really inspired this. And when we first met in Australia, I was slightly intimidated by moving onto the turf of some other great scholar when I hadn't really worked on internet politics. My previous work was international relations, studying the UN, studying these massive, slow bureaucracies. And I thought, what am I getting myself into? But I should say I had become fascinated because I had met these groups about a year or so earlier, groups like MoveOn that exist around the world in Berlin. And I was just struck by this puzzling empirical question. How is it that we have such similar types of organizations in such different countries? So the MoveOn effect that Dave has written about, and I'll refer to, is about MoveOn's effect on US politics. And in a way, my book takes off from that and says, what has the MoveOn effect been internationally and globally? And I think I would probably have riffed off the title a lot more if I had been writing for political communication scholars. Problem for me is I'm writing for international relations scholars who've never heard of MoveOn and don't even know the basics of what the organization does. So in many ways, I'm just going to whet your appetite in terms of the kinds of research I'm doing. And then feel free to ask me questions all around. And also Dave can sort of probe at some of the findings, because I think the findings of the book, which I will share now, are both kind of back to the political communications literature about exactly how this organizational model has spread, where it's failed, where it's succeeded, as well as back to the international relations literature about thinking more deeply about what forms of cooperation are possible at the transnational level. So just those of you who aren't quite as familiar maybe with MoveOn or the MoveOn model, I think it's worthwhile just pointing out that the groups that I'm talking about, while they operate in the digital era, they are mobilizing people offline, right? So I got really interested in understanding the impacts of organizations like MoveOn that occur both online and offline. And I study them using ethnography, and I'll talk back to that. So to give you a couple of examples, Campact in Germany, which actually originally wanted to be named, like MoveOn Germany, and they went to MoveOn and asked for the German email list from MoveOn. Campact has been extremely successful at mobilizing thousands of people around issues like trade, climate. This was one example. I was actually living in Berlin at the time where I was working. They got 250,000 people out onto the streets to protest against TTIP and CETA. And they were one of the main organizers and coalition builders in Germany. So they were forming coalitions with other NGOs and unions. This is Christoph Bautz, who's one of the spokespersons for Campact. He was speaking at this and many other events that they had. And the proponents of TTIP and CETA have come out and said, actually, CAMPAC was a real pain because they were so effective at mobilizing. And one of the interesting puzzles that hasn't been investigated is the German mobilizations were actually much larger than many other mobilizations in other European countries, which is somewhat puzzling for a comparativist because Germany stood more to win from these trade agreements than, say, Southern European countries. So one of the things we could point to is that CAMPAC has played quite a pivotal role. In New Zealand, at a similar time, Action Station, which is the New Zealand variation, was really active, although it was a much smaller organization, but it was one of in the coalition of trying to get people against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And actually one chapter of the book looks at these groups and how they've coalesced around an anti-free trade agenda. Meanwhile, in Poland, a very different context, and this is fascinating for those of you who are kind of thinking about how models of activism or advocacy changes and can shift across countries. There's a group, Aksja Demokracja, that follows actually CAMPAC and learned about the CAMPAC, so it didn't learn directly from Move On. They set up an organization and they were very involved in campaigns to defend the rights of the judiciary. Then in Israel, a completely different country again, we've got an organization led by a woman, Raluca, who had worked for Avaz and then started to work and set up her own organization called Zazim. And they've done a lot of work in the numerous elections that have been happening in Israel in the last few years, trying to get Bedouin women, trying to get people to the polls, but also campaigned on a range of issues from like trying to stop development in Tel Aviv. So the point I'm trying to make here is it's very easy to slip straight into talking about online petitions, the role of digital technology, but I want you to have in your mind as we talk through this presentation and as you tease out the kind of findings that these groups are mobilizing offline as well as online. And as I've already said, I mean, I owe a lot to Dave's work because the Move On Effect did so much to explain the model of what Move On is, of redefining membership in the digital era, lowering the bar so that people could just sign up to a petition, and that email address then became a massive resource for these organizations to be used in subsequent campaigns. And of course, in Dave's subsequent work, Analytic Activism, his 2016 book, looking at how groups like Move On particularly, but sister organizations like even 38 Degrees are testing campaigns, figuring out which campaigns to run based on member surveys, based on response rates to emails, trying to fine tune also what messaging works best, trying to optimize donations. This has been well chronicled in the political communication scholarship. However, IR scholars have never heard of this. So when I give this talk, everyone's like, what is going on? Let's do the 101. What's important, though, is I think that the political communication scholarship has mostly focused on the impact of these organizations in their national contexts. So Move On is about Move On's impact on American political advocacy, and obviously makes a very strong, important point. Ariadne Vroman has written about Get Up in Australia, but it's about Get Up's role in Australia. 38 Degrees and the role of Andy Chadwick and James Dennis, again, extremely important in telling us about 38 Degrees in the UK. So for me, coming in as an IR scholar with my sort of curiosity about transnational, what's Get Learning, what's being shared, how are these groups collaborating, I felt like there was a real space, a really fertile space to be writing in. I should also say I have a bit of an advantage. I'm originally from New Zealand, so I knew the New Zealand-Australian context. I've been living in Berlin and Italy while working for an American university. So it's meant I've been very mobile and able to move around. And I know that that has been an important part of doing research, because as Dave said, these guys, while they're digital, they meet annually at various summits and share tactics and tech and messaging. And it's been really crucial for my research to be able to go to all of those places. So what we're talking about is a global phenomenon. We're talking about a model of organization that now exists in 19 countries. And this is the data Open has, 1 in 15 domestic voters claim to have, to be part of these networks, although we can talk about whether or not everyone realizes that they are members. Over 6 continents. And there have actually been new organizations that have joined since I finished the book, 1 in Brazil. It's worthwhile noting, and we can talk about this, that this is probably one of the things that's more interesting and that the book doesn't fully get into, but there have been a lot of failed cases, attempts to set up these organizations, including there's been a couple of failed attempts in France, Spain, Italy, an organization got off the ground and then it basically collapsed, and we can talk about why that might be. Indonesia, Colombia, Guatemala, sometimes organizations or activists started conversations and they started reaching out to people who work at groups like Get Up in Australia and saying, how does this model work, and decided not to do it. And sometimes they got further down the path and then decided not to establish the organization. But it's important to note in all of the context, all of the organizations operate in democracies, not in authoritarian regimes. And as we'll see, that's because a big part of the model is mobilizing citizens to put pressure on democratically elected officials. So the questions that drive my research are twofold. One, do digital advocacy organizations challenge IR theories of advocacy? And the short answer is yes. The traditional idea of like long-term sustained commitment to a cause, which is how we think of like groups like Oxfam or Greenpeace, we don't see these digital, what I call digital advocacy organizations, which I'll say is not the best name, but it's a clumsy way to try and get at what's distinct about them from older school NGOs. These newer groups like Move On are much rapid response and able to use analytic activism to really be extremely member driven and switch campaigns rapidly and mobilize rapidly. And the second part, which I won't talk about in today's short talk in my talk, but please feel free to ask, I do look quite in depth at how these groups campaign transnationally. So in terms of the methods, as I've said, I spent 5 years doing a lot of participant observation, collecting over 100 interviews and collecting an original data set of their campaign actions. And Dave is in there, and so am I, smiling in this photo. This was in Vancouver when we were just outside Vancouver in the Rocky Mountains, soon after the Trump election. So this was a particularly interesting summit because people were scratching their heads about Brexit and Trump and going, how do we as organizations respond to this? And what is our role as a network? What can we learn from the US to the UK, to New Zealand, to Germany, to Sweden, to Poland? And I'm happy to share some of those conversations. So the argument in the book is twofold. Firstly, the first one, there's more to it than what's there, but that these organizations get their power from mobilizing people in a rapid response way and not from expertise, which is a big part of the way IR or international relations scholars think about advocacy, and that they've formed a transnational network, this network Open, which you just saw an image of. And this group's campaign quite frequently on transnational issues like climate, refugees, trade, but the way they do it is targeting the nation state rather than trying to target an international institution like the World Bank or the UNFCCC or a business. So that second part I have data on and I'm happy to show it, but I won't go into it in depth. And I just want to show you the way it's sort of challenging the thinking in international relations about advocacy. And maybe it will spur some interesting conversations, both today, but also for future work I'm doing. So the first part I think is really interesting is that all of these groups are engaged actively in election campaigning. And the ways that international relations scholars think about advocacy is much more issue-based, done by charities. And charities, by their very nature, have to be have tax-free status, so they get tax benefits, and what that means is they can't engage in election campaigning. So essentially what I'm saying is we have quite a narrow tunnel vision in a lot of the scholarship of only focusing on a certain type of advocacy actor and not groups like Move On, interestingly, has both a 501c3 and a 501c4 status. And the fact it has these two legal statuses means on the one hand, it can get tax benefits and get donations that are tax-free. And on the other hand, through its other entity, it can also engage in election campaigning. And I think that actual legal model is something I'm doing some more thinking about now is really important. The fact that you engage in elections, though, is much more than just like you can go out on the streets. It's also because you can hold politicians to account at that precise time when they're most vulnerable. So it's about, this model is about thinking not just how do we progress on an issue in a kind of like not apolitical, but less political way, but how do we even make sure that the politicians who get into office are going to push forward on a progressive issue when we want them to. And I should note they're all progressive organizations. They do this during, using conventional tools of like door knocking or canvassing. This is some of the examples of GetUp, and they have been very successful, as political communication scholars will be well aware. GetUp in Australia helped to unseat Tony Abbott, a former prime minister, and he's even acknowledged GetUp. These other three elements very much go hand in hand, and they're about how organizations like Move On, like GetUp, like Action Station New Zealand are able to very rapidly scale up new campaigns. Obviously, online petitions help them, but they're also multi-issue generalists. So they switch between issues very quickly, depending on their members' interests. And as Dave's works talked about in analytic activism, you can figure out members' interests by whether they open emails, whether they click through and take the actual actions. And you can actually just survey them, like a number of the groups, survey their members and rank what issue is most important. So altogether, that creates a very different model or a very different type of campaign from the kind of long-term, more issue expert, staff-driven campaigning that's in the international relations world. And just to also give you a sense, the kind of data I'm collecting, I also looked at things like how they're funded, which is really important. And this was in 2018, and we can get into why some organizations might have less or more, but essentially the big organizations, the more established ones, are predominantly funded by their members. Right. And this is an important part because they're member funded, their accountability is back to their members. But it also means that they have to make sure that any campaigns they run, their members are going to support. So I'll give you two examples of campaigns and then I will hand back to Q&A. One of the campaigns that I look at is the refugee welcome campaigns that rippled across the open network in late 2015. Why is this an interesting case? Many of the organizations in this open network, like 38 Degrees, weren't actually actively campaigning on refugee rights when the refugee so-called crisis hit. But they quickly could pivot, rapid response, set up a new campaign, ask their members to donate and or sign the petition to welcome refugees. And in many cases, they were part of transnational or national coalitions to put pressure on the governments to increase the refugee quota. So it kind of plays to the strength of the model, right? There's an ask, there's a moment, and there's high public interest in refugee issues, and these groups all scale up. In the UK, I sort of look at how this model worked, and we did see the Prime Minister David Cameron increasing the refugee quota. A side point, I'm not claiming in the book that it was just because of 38 Degrees activities. Obviously, they were part of a bigger coalition, but I'm trying to show how the model works. But here comes the hitch. So 38 Degrees is fast, it's rapid response, it's member driven, but that also results in its dropping campaigns rapidly when it loses member interest. So the book sets out the strengths of this model analytically, but it also points to some of the weaknesses. And this is just one of them. I go into others in the book. But 38 Degrees, and I visited them several months after this campaign, switched from the refugee campaign to saving the bees. And staff members told me it was because bees brought in more money. They could get more money generated from a campaign and more member support by running this bees campaign. And even though they never, knew whether or not the refugees actually got resettled, there were still massive problems with children on the other side of Calais not being able to get into the UK, and there was a whole debate in the news. Because member interest wasn't there, 38 Degrees didn't continue to campaign on it. It was highly reactive and responsive. So part of the book is trying to tease out these kinds of strengths and weaknesses of the model. And I want to leave you with this last point, and that's to say that the book, one of the joys of studying these groups for 5 years was that it wasn't just me that came to this conclusion. This was a collective conclusion, actually a lot of it around the time of that 2016 summit in Vancouver, was that one of the problems with this rapid reactive model was it didn't transform people's preferences. It was hard to run for minority campaigns for minority rights. It was easier to run popular campaigns. So 38 Degrees ran into another problem on Brexit because their members there wasn't a clear majority for a campaign to keep the UK in the EU. And so what do? They campaigned neutrally to put information into public debate rather than campaigning, although their staff were very pro-Remain, during one of arguably the most important moments in the UK politics in the last, 50, maybe even 100 years, this organization campaigned neutrally. And they got a lot of pushback actually at that summit for this very reason. So some of the organizations have now argued and shifted their model to be more stewardship or staff and value driven, to try and transform their members' preferences over time and run more sustained campaigns. Now that comes down to the staff themselves selecting issues like refugee rights in Australia or Māori rights in New Zealand that become core priorities regardless of members' interest. And this is one example of what happened in Australia, where they did a massive campaign and vigils around 2015. So at the same time as that UK campaign. But then when I was there in early 2016, they continued to campaign on refugee rights, and they had a long-term objective to get all refugees out of Nauru and Manus Island. So the point I'm trying to make is A, there's strengths and weaknesses of this model, the member-driven logic, but also that the model has evolved over time. And I think that that's really interesting to take note of. I think I'll leave it there and hand over for Q&A, and if and when it's, I can bring up more slides if it's useful.
Fantastic, thanks. So if people have questions, you can either type them in the chat or raise hands. I plan on chatting with Nina until other people will speak up with questions. I also want to note, I noticed at least one person who's joining us today, rather than being one of us GW academics, is actually one of the practitioners who we used to get to hang out with. Hi, Amara. So if folks are coming from the advocacy sector and have experience with this they want to share, or thoughts or questions, please jump in as well, because that's particularly great to see. So one thing I want to sort of point to and fiddle with a little bit. You mentioned digital advocacy groups as sort of a tough frame. And I think that's right in an interesting way, that when we're looking international relations, usually we're talking about NGOs. And domestically in the United States, we're talking about, we would either call them advocacy groups or interest groups. But like, as somebody who came into this field studying MoveOn.org, part of the world they're entering into, like the water that they're entering into, is a nation that has an overwhelmingly well-developed interest group landscape, right? So you mentioned that MoveOn.org has a 501c3 and a 501c4 arm. My old organization, the Sierra Club, I used to brag that distinction originated kind of with the Sierra Club back in the 1960s. They did a bunch of really aggressive advocacy, and then their tax status was clouded back in the 1960s. And then Congress passed a Tax Reform Act and created 501c4 status. But that also means that by the time MoveOn comes onto the scene, there's this elaborate system for how narrow interest groups can do political organizing, can work in elections. And part of what I found interesting about this network is the way that we're seeing this model get exported to other countries that don't have a massive interest group sector, right? Like Australia, like Canada's got interest groups, but not nearly the numbers that the US has, which also means that they don't have the same foundation, like number of foundations. They don't have either the large donors or the small donor habits that tend to support that. So the question that I have, particularly since you studied this network of groups more in depth, and particularly have studied a lot of the groups that came up after I kind of left this field, is like, what kind of modifications have they made, particularly in South America and Eastern Europe, in places that have an NGO sector rather than an interest group sector? Like, what things have they had to make up on the fly in order to make this model fit in nation states that aren't starting from that background?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most basic things is that for many of these organizations, even explaining how they operate to funders was really difficult. So there was a lot of translation issues. I know, talking to particularly the Eastern Europeans, even the term progressive didn't make sense or translate easily across different cultures. The idea of being member funded was really difficult. I think one organization that's had to be quite inventive is Amandla Mobi in South Africa, because Amandla Mobi found it more difficult to get a high degree of member funding, like the data I showed. They've relied more on grants and grant funding. And one of the implications of that has been that they've had to be more conscientious about impact of their campaigns and actually tracking it and studying it to give to funders. Because of course, the political economy of these organizations is that if you're working for Move On or Action Station New Zealand or Get Up, you're just accountable primarily to your members, and you send them a report and you say, hey, we did this or we did that. And your members are unlikely to like go look at the report and then say, hey, can you actually prove that you did, this campaign led to this outcome, right? I mean, if you overstate it too much, people might be skeptical. But funders, of course, have a higher degree of concern about ensuring kind of a robustness of those claims. So I think that's one of probably the more interesting in terms of the funding model. I think another thing I found particularly interesting, which is a spin-off of this question about which groups remained reactive and which remained more value-led, is that many focused a lot on collaboration with other NGOs. And so when this was first initiated, it was a sort of fast and furious, let's just go fast, and if we break, whatever, just move on to the next campaign. Now, many organizations matured over time, but particularly in smaller democracies, like in New Zealand and the Netherlands, we saw you couldn't do that. Like, you would see that person down at the pub if you were fast and furious, and they would not be happy. And so Action Station, particularly, even back in 2016, already had models of collaboration that they were working on with other NGOs. And they were investing time in coalitions. And these were the kind of conversations at summits where some people were like, don't waste time sitting in meetings with a whole lot of NGOs that have to sign things off. It's going to take far too long. Just go for the campaign. So very different understandings of the role. Is the role to be fast and furious and just get out there and scale up at critical moments? Or is the role to really listen and be like attune with others in the sector and try and help out where you can and you have an added advantage? There's some of the differences.
Jason asked the question, was Avaaz involved in the study for the book?
Yes and no. I tried to get them involved. I reached out, but in honesty, I couldn't get the same level of access to Open. So it's partly, I guess, a compliment that Open gave me as much access as they did. And I was always very straightforward. I did talk with a number of Avaaz people. I do talk about its origins in the chapter. I talk about global diffusion. But it's not in like the subsequent set of data in the second half of the book, and partly because it's not part of the network. So those of you who aren't familiar with Open, what's interesting is it's not actually an open network at all. It's quite closed. And the network only has one organization per country. So Color of Change, for instance, a spin-off from Move On, is not part of that network. We Move, which is a regional European organization like Move On, is not part of that network formally. Some of Us, which works on businesses, is not part of the network. These are kind of the next layer out. And the reason behind that decision by the Open, this is obviously, it's nothing to do with me, but the Open founders wanted to have high trust, and they didn't want competition over members. So they wanted everyone that came to those summits to feel really comfortable sharing whatever, and there was a lot shared. And the only way to do that was by ensuring there wasn't competition over membership.
I want to add a bit to that and use it to lead into my next question for you. Well, first, as an aside, I believe, at least for a while, there was a US equivalent of the Open Summit, which was like Move On and Color of Change and all the other digital groups coming together. I never got invited to those conferences, even in the United States. So I didn't get to observe them, but I know that they had that going on as well, so they could do stuff domestically. But the other interesting thing to me about Avaaz and the decision not to include it is the Open Network is founded originally by a guy named Ben Branzel, who I wrote about to the Nation back in 2013 after the first Open Summit. And Ben, who's in the photo, he's the guy who looks a lot like me. That was like a running joke, if you might remember. But Ben was a Move On staffer who kind of learned this model, spent a little time in Get Up with Get Up in one of their elections, and kind of had this moment where he realized that replicated the same model as Move On, but scaled it up to build power much faster, and sort of had this moment of realizing, like, this is a model, and if we teach other people this model and help them start it around the world, then they can power build in a really interesting way. And Ben, along the route to that, also co-founds Avaz. So he's one of the co-founders of Avaz. It's not like they're excluding Avaz because there's some sort of competition, they're doing different things, so much as it's a sense of like knowing the DNA of these different organizations. Like occasionally an Avaz staffer would like come and hang out at one of these summits, just like Taryn from Some of Us would occasionally come and hang out at summits. But the sense of where do we draw the lines is coming from a very detailed understanding of what these groups are.
Yeah.
Now that leads to the question that I wanted to ask you. Is Ben leaves the open network in, I want to say 2018, it was either 2018 or 2019. And you mentioned there's been a lot of growth since then. So the story that I was kind of telling about Ben in 2013, the story that was true for 2013, was of Ben as this sort of like unique Johnny Appleseed character, going around the world, consulting with people, helping them to figure out how to set up this model in their own nation states. And then they start coming together as the open network so that they can sort of like share ideas and support each other. That's a very sort of like founder-led, oversimplified story. And particularly now that they're in a post-Ben era and still growing, I'm wondering what things you've noticed about how open has changed now that it's no longer centered around this one charismatic individual.
Yeah, great question. So for those who aren't familiar, I think it's important to note that there were different sort of growth stages, because I don't think the growth has been steady. And I think there has been a plateau. So there were the four or five organizations in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and Germany that got together to form the network. And so what happened very early on is that emulation was occurring, where activists in the Anglosphere were like, wow, look at Move On. We have some direct experience. Let's go and emulate it. And Ben became quite important in the Canadian and in the UK case. And then once he established open, he was the Johnny Appleseed, like you described. Like he was going around, traveling all around the world. You never knew where he would be, like literally from one day to the next, and helping groups found actively looking to set up organizations in Ireland and Israel. They conducted desirability and feasibility studies where they would go and map out the progressive sector, say in Israel, and interview potential heads. So there was a really big growth period, I'd say, of the network around before I started studying it really actively, around 2013, 14, 15. And then as I was getting more into it, I was seeing new faces all the time at the Open Summit, from Colombia, from a range of places, heard about initiatives in Nepal. But I think that although there are new organizations, I think it has slowed down. I think it would be fair to say. And part of that is COVID. I think it was hard to do the kind of work. You did have to do it in person. It's really hard to do the sort of building trust, figuring out who can set up an organization without actually going in person. And I think a part of it is also like Ben had a particular style of doing it. He's extremely charismatic. He really knew the model inside out. He had been the one who thought of what's called the eightfold path. And Giovanna Negretti, who's taken her over, is very committed, very focused on the network, but she didn't come through the digital organizing background. Her strength has been in trying to push for groups in the global South. And so they've just had their first Americas and Latin America summit, included groups from a Brazilian group, Nossos, which is now part of the network, as well as some activists who I think are thinking about the model in Mexico, and I think also Colombia. So there is still some potential, and there's a new group in Serbia, but I would say it's not like that same rate of growth is continuing to occur.
So if
but it's just one small note on this. One of the things I think is most fascinating is where are the groups the strongest? And it's often clustered around particular places. So there's a lot of European groups because they can learn from each other. Eastern Europe is surprisingly, I don't know if it's surprising, I find it really impressive, that the strength of the Romanian and the Polish group. So I think often you wouldn't necessarily think of them. Hungary also has an organization. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics here for comparative political scientists, who want to go on and think more about these questions. Why do they grow in some areas and not in others?
I have more questions, but we have two in the chat and one hand up. Let me start with Bailey asking in the chat. Typically, we see transnational digital advocacy as a general good for addressing key socio-political issues. Have you seen examples where these models of digital advocacy networks have been co-opted for more problematic or nefarious movements or issues? How should we try to conceptualize, reconcile the good with the bad in these models? Basically, are the bad guys doing this too?
Yeah, no. So obviously all these groups are progressive, and if you're progressive, then you're happy they exist. And if you're not, maybe not so much. The question there is really about emulation by the right. And I have a paper I'm working on now with two colleagues at the Weizenbaum Institute asking, are there copycats? And Dave already has talked about it in his previous work in the US. There were several groups around that copied Move On when Move On was really successful in the Iraq War period. Now, what we're doing is 10 years later going, okay, where are we at now? And what we've found is, and it was actually quite hard, I should say, to find the copycats. Like, it wasn't immediately obvious to us. And we actually surveyed a bunch of activists and asked them if they knew copycats in their own environment. And I can go more into that in depth if it's of interest, but essentially we found several groups, one in Australia, Advance Australia, which explicitly wants to be a conservative Get Up. And they even had like a Get Up figurine, which was sort of a very weird thing, which backfired. There's one in Germany called Patriot Petition. In the US, there's a group called Grassfire, which is not prominent. It's not a big group. It's just this random one thing. Yeah. And this is a point to make. None of the groups are really strong and powerful. So they've tried to emulate. The right-wing actors have gone, wow, what is the left? What is this model? How does it work? And I think they've looked from the outside without necessarily understanding the way the member-driven rapid response model works. The one exception that I think is strong is the international one, Citizen Go. And that's emulated Avaz. And there's actually a book coming out by Philip Ayoub and I think it's Marina Sturkel, looking at Citizen Go amongst a number of other right-wing groups, which I would really recommend that book. So anyway, so in our study, we've asked this question and essentially we found there are copycats. Mostly they're not so impactful and strong, and partly it's because the model isn't understood. And most of the time they tend to be more hierarchically organizing. So top down, not so much member driven. But that doesn't mean that the right isn't organized online and that they're not successful, right? We're just asking about one specific case of organizational emulation.
I want to add just one note on that. I often think back to Jen Schrade's book, The Revolution That Wasn't, which is about conservative use of digital media, though mostly focused in the United States. Because the bit that she lines up that hadn't occurred to me before is the ways that their theory of change tends to differ from the progressive theory of change. Conservative advocacy groups in the United States are mostly trying to troll people and distribute information, like distributing information is a win. Whereas the liberal groups that she was studying were like trying to start a union in North Carolina in a right to work state. And the obvious thing is like one of those things is harder than the other. But that also leads to a bunch of conservative success because what they're trying to achieve isn't the same. And I mentioned that because like I studied groups like Grassfire, again, like back in 2011. And the thing that stood out is they definitely wanted to be a Move On because Move On was big and they wanted to be able to say to their funders like, hey, give us money so we can do that. But they weren't committed to member funding or deep member engagement because their theory of power didn't require it. Like what they wanted to do was distract people so that, you know, like the rich don't have to pay taxes or get regulated. And so like, I think that's the reason why even when what I would call the bad guys are engaging in a lot of digital activism, it tends not, I think, to have the same structure because these structures are actually like they require a lot of maintenance and you'd only do all that work if it was necessary for power building and success. And they've got an easier task, so I think they don't bother with it. Let's go to Jason next. Also, Nina, I want to note that there's a question from Valentin. What's the name of the book and the authors that you just mentioned? So if you can type that in while Jason asks his question.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I had to unmute myself or you. David, you led in my question perfectly. Thank you for that. I was at the Open Summit in 2015. I think it was 2015 in Berlin. And one of the conversations we had with a bunch of groups was this sense of like, we're being successful. We're hitting our metrics. We're growing. Get Up could say they were the biggest political party in Australia, but something didn't seem right. And it was a question of like, are we actually winning though? Are we being successful and are we building power? And this was before Trump. This was looking at Obama and saying like, we didn't shut down Guantanamo. Climate change isn't getting better. Sorry, my son. Leon, 1 second. So, sorry. So Move On made a choice to kind of not be partisan, right? They're political, but they're not like old groups that are trying to take over a political party, or the Tea Party, who specifically said, we want to take over a political party. And I'm wondering if your research uncovered any issues around, you mentioned that a lot of people can be claimed as members, but they don't see themselves as members of these groups. And I think a criticism has been we've built email lists, but we didn't actually build movements. And the way that civic groups were powerful in the last century, and the way that political parties, that by that decision to be this separate thing actually has hurt us from growing and taking power at this crucial time.
So the first engagement that I really had with the Open Network, it felt like they were still trying to unpack that question. So in 2016, Felix Kolb, the head of CAMPAC, one of the founders, actually said, we want to understand what success looks like across the Open Network. And I said, I'm, as a researcher, happy to put my hand up, do something internal. And basically I went around and asked all the groups how they understood their own success. And there was this exact tension between, are we getting, the sort of vanity metrics of like increasing numbers of members as one definition of success? And that was necessary for financial security, right? Like you need to be keeping going members, you need to be keeping people regularly returning for action and giving donations. And that was like one lens. There was a lens of like, are we winning campaigns, right? Like, are we actually making the policy changes? And then there was the like other conception of success, which is like, are we building this broad movement that actually is making our entire country more progressive? And what was interesting is they were all, and continue, I would say, to be struggling on how to understand the relationship between those, because it's messy. And as a social scientist, it's like, yeah, you can win the Keystone pipeline 1 year and then it gets reversed by Trump and then it gets reversed back by Biden. It's like, how do you like theorize and think through what's going to happen there? So I don't have a neat answer for like solving that problem. I would recommend though one book which to me sticks in my mind on this about members' identity, and that's Dana Fisher's work on the resistance to Trump. It's called American Resistance. And what she does is really cool. She's a sociologist, so she goes out and like interviews people in all the big protests in DC, from March on Science, Women's March, March for Our Lives. And what she finds is a lot of people are out there for the first time, but also a lot of people have been mobilized by Move On, and Move On was really crucial as a backbone to the resistance to Trump. But interestingly, a lot of people didn't identify as Move On members. And I guess the question is, does it matter if they don't identify, if they are still going out? Does it matter if they don't have that branding? And I think there's similar questions now in the climate campaigns, right? We've got new groups like Fridays for Future, Sunrise, who are more successfully mobilizing, but often some of these groups are providing critical infrastructure, whether it be training or like tech in the background or comms advice. And does it matter that they're not like the seen ones? I don't know. It's an open question. For organizational survival, maybe it does if they don't get enough funding. For winning the campaigns and building the progressive movement, maybe it's better if the young kids are leading. I mean, these are open questions.
Yeah, that I want to add on to that, and then we're going to go to Valentin's question. This is something that I noticed a lot in the early Trump years in the US, that like Move On in particular was engaged in what I would positively call movement generosity. This was the time where sort of the resistance was growing. New groups were leading the charge. And I would occasionally get asked by people like, hey, is Move On still around? I don't hear about them anymore. And the answer was, yes, they're still around. In fact, the new groups that you're hearing about, you're probably hearing about from emails from Move On that are encouraging you to go to these protests that are branded around somebody new. So like they're working with was it like Swing District and a bunch of the other groups whose names I'm just blanking on because I haven't had enough coffee today. And what they've kind of decided is like this song doesn't need to be about us, rather than centering this as a move-on style of as a move-on event, and then dealing with a bunch of internal coalition politics of credit claiming. Like, we're going to center the new folks. It's their moment in the sun. I mean, they did this around Occupy as well back in, what was it, 2011, where they listed Occupy and said, all right, we're going to do whatever we can to help, but we're not going to try to come in and make this our thing. And I think from my politics, like, I think that's good, while also having the limit of that doesn't build member identity, which has some downsides for power building. The other thing that sticks out to me, and I will turn this into a question for you, Nina, if we have time at the end, but I also want to get out to other people's questions. But it's always stuck out to me as also a variable that changes by country, right? Because in the United States, there's a very simple answer why Move On is not a party. And that's because we have an electoral system that incentivizes two parties. If they ran as a third party, they'd basically be the Greens. And the question that I often heard about Get Up early on was, okay, like, why isn't Get Up the Green Party in Australia? And or like, if Get Up has a set of like policy beliefs that they as an organization hold, like, it's a multi-party system, like, why isn't there a Get Up party? And that's actually that's an open question in Australia in a way that it is in the United States, because the electoral systems differ. Like, they have an answer to it, but I feel like it's a more complicated it's a more complicated question to answer in these other countries, where it would be reasonable to start a ninth party, because if 3 million people really believe in them, then they can actually build they can get some elected seats for the Get Up party or for some other party. So I'm curious how we've seen that work out in other countries. But before putting you on the spot for that, I wanted to phrase Valentine's question. Would you say that the findings and implications of your research are limited to the open network because other orgs, Change.org, some of us, Avaz, have substantially other logics?
Great. Thanks for all those reflections. So yeah, answering your question, Valentin, the findings, I'd say there's two big findings in the book, and they break down to smaller ones. And I'd say the first set of findings that I really presented to you do apply to other organizations. And that is that the member-driven rapid response multi-issue model has a weakness when it's in its purest form. And that is that you're reactive, so you quickly scale up a campaign, but then you drop it when members lose interest. And I'd say, I mean, there is variation in how much those organizations like Avaz and some of us do a pure member-driven, but when they do operate on that basis, yes, there's a weakness. Change.org is a little bit different as a beast, as you know, because it's sort of like for-profit, it's just petition, it accepts across the political spectrum, it has different logic. So I would be hesitant to try and apply my reading there. But I do think this tension between purely member-driven and having some kind of staff-driven is an important tension. And I'm not saying that there's a right or a wrong, although I have my own normative beliefs about which organizations are kind of doing more meaningful campaigns. I mean, to me, the really interesting stuff is what's the political ecology you're operating in, and what is the role that groups like some of us or groups like Move On can play? Where can they magnify other groups? The points that Dave Karpf was just making about generosity. And because there are particular things, and I name that in the research, there's a moment where a very specific refugee rights campaign gets off in New Zealand. It has no members, it has no ability to mobilize, and they put their petition on Action Station boosts it, and you see a campaign win to double the New Zealand refugee quota. So it's really like this tiny specific issue that campaign group would never have got a win on without the petition platform. The other logic, though, which I haven't really talked about here, is the transnational dimension, and I sort of alluded to the fact that the open groups, because their model is nationally based, are focused on national targets. I think that doesn't travel as easily because Avaz often does these campaigns, solidarity against Trump, let's kick out the US president, or campaigns at the World Trade Organization. They'll often do more international. Some of us also does business. So I think the logic there is a bit different, but I think what it is useful to keep in mind is how effective are those campaigns, right? What is the theory of change to get a whole of international liberals to say they don't like Trump? I'm not, it's nice. We might all enjoy that feeling of signing a petition to say we're really sad the US elected Trump, but what then happens, right? And so I think in a way, my work would point maybe to the limitations, even if you are doing those kind of international campaigns. What is it all for? Where is the theory? So, and on your question, Dave, about why haven't more of them become political parties? It's interesting. I've never heard them discuss it, but there's never been a like, oh, shall we become a political party conversation at the summit. But what I have seen is some forms of competition. So the Italian group that set up, the founder of it claimed that one of the struggles for him is that the five-star party existed in Italy. And the five-star party in Italy, for those of you who aren't familiar, is kind of a bit of a chameleon. It is sort of progressive, but it has some really wacky issues. But what's important is that they crowdsourced a lot of their positions, right? So that their operating model was kind of progressive at the outset, although you can argue it went in weird directions. And then listening to members to figure out what to campaign on. And it had this kind of member-driven model of a political party. And so when the Italian group Progressi tried to get started by this journalist, he said he thinks one of the reasons, I don't have evidence beyond his claim, he thinks one of the reasons was it was a struggle to get members, so that there is competition, I think, sometimes between these new forms of political party and these organizations. To me, the way that I saw this conversation happening more was about the different electoral systems, the British, first past the post, or the US, versus, say, New Zealand or Germany that have mixed member proportional systems, and the roles that they had to play, as you well know, was so different, because it's much harder to get somebody out of a swing seat and therefore have an impact on an election if you're operating in the German, New Zealand mixed member proportional system. Yeah, I'll leave it at that to open up for any more questions.
So we've only got about 5 minutes left. And there's one other thing that I wanted to ask you. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it. And if somebody puts their hand up, then I'll make you answer really quick. You prefaced in the slides that there's like interesting lessons to be learned from where this model has failed. What are your 1 or 2 bullet points for either what you've learned from the failures, or what, if you went back into the field and studied some more, what are your hypotheses about the story that we can learn from the failures?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things I heard a lot was the value of having a cohort of groups in similar countries close to you. So the reason I think Eastern Europe people have talked about being really successful was because, you had a group in Poland, you had a group in Hungary, you had a group in Romania, you've also got Austria close by. And so they were able to share and support each other. Now, when you tried to set up a group all on its own in Colombia, which happened, and I talk about in the book, and there was no other Latin American groups, this person's on their own time zone, they had worked at a VARS, they understand the model, but there's no one they can chat to, no one who really understands. If you're from a neighboring country, you generally understand that country a bit better than if you're from a 12-hour flight away. And in her case, there was also security threats. A lot of NGOs in Colombia were facing security threats. So I think this idea of sort of exporting something without an environment around it of other similar organizations to exchange and support. And it often came up that the New Zealand group, people would go across to Australia in the early days and just hang out and learn about the model. And the Irish group went across to the UK and hung out and learned about the model. So that was one of the really interesting things, is the strength of secondments and the strength of having neighbors who are doing a similar thing that you can share with on the same time zone, who kind of understand your context.
I'm glad you got a chance to mention the secondments as well, because I feel like that's a critical thing that was going on there. It's also a word that I did not know until I started hanging out with the Open Network. It's not a US English word very much.
I know. Word
right?
docs never quite understand what I mean when I say it. It always gets spell checked.
Actually, so just to be clear, secondments are when a staffer goes and spends time with another organization, usually to help them out around elections or some other specific campaign. And in so doing, kind of is the transmission point for learning how different organizations operate, right?
And exactly that. And I didn't talk so much here, but I really want to emphasize the strength of this network, which is phenomenal. And there's a whole chapter on what's shared. So it's not just tactics and messaging and summits. There's funding going in through this network. So there's a fund to set up new groups. There's like mentoring where people actively go out and help other groups, and you host other people in your country. So it's an incredibly thick level of learning that's happening, which is fascinating if you're interested in like diffusion of tactics or social movements and like yeah, all sorts of questions that I think arise out of what's happening within this very tight network.
But that's also really interesting, sort of like I'm sure empirically it's messier than this, but the idea of the spread is going to happen mostly across neighboring geographies because of existing limitations, like, you know, like if we are not like we need to be able to travel to each other, we need to be on close enough to the same time zones that it's easy to talk to each other. Like I never observed it, but I remember hearing about the mess that was Open trying to set up like board Zoom calls because they were across, you know, like 5 different time zones around the world, including the international dateline. Like that's just a giant pain.
Thanks, Amara, for your fun fact. She says, I don't think I would have been able to run Lead Now in Canada. It was a really important election if I hadn't been seconded or spent time and move on. So there you go. Thanks for sharing that.
And also, just to be clear, she doesn't want to toot her own horn, but Amara and team crushed it in that 2015 election campaign too. Like absolutely crushed it. One last question from Valentin. Do you know studies papers on the broader implications of this model for political theory and democracy? How do these always change the development of democracy and political participation? Basically, besides the two of us, who else did the literature on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to keep brainstorming. I don't know anything that's doing it in the sort of political theory space, but I do think there's great work out there. I would recommend Michael Vaughan's work. He's doing a lot of comparative work on tax justice campaigns, 38 Degrees versus Get Up. Obviously, I've named Ariadne Vroman. I've named also the work of James Dennis, thinking in this space. But most people are working more in the political communication space. So there's a huge demand. I mean, in a way, I guess I want to also hand the baton on, just like Dave did to me, and say, you know, I've written some stuff. I'm really happy for others to get in on this and think about implications in different spaces, because I obviously come at it with one set of questions. And I think there's a lot more to be explored.
Yeah, the one that I would add, Andy Chadwick, who you mentioned earlier, but he did a piece, God, like it was, I think, one of the earliest pieces in this field, describing these organizations as hybrid organizations, as a mix of interest group and political party. That is, in terms of like big picture theory, I think the biggest picture. I've always struggled with that a little bit, because the way that he describes them as hybrid, I think the Sierra Club in the US would also qualify as hybrid. Like it actually has all of those same things. So I think it's a little overdetermined. It's also an early piece, but like what's noteworthy is I don't think anybody has taken a swing at figuring out how do you fit these organizations into our understanding of politics more broadly. There's a bunch of really good scholars, but each of us has like picked a country and focused on that country. And then Nina has picked international relations and figured out how do these fit in, how does the network fit into international relations? So there's way more to be done, and please do it.
Exactly. And just finishing up, I think that also points to the opening question Dave asked, is like, how do we even conceptualize what these groups are? And I would say my terminology has its limits because they're not defined by being digital. The reason I use that is because I'm speaking to an international relations audience that has never ever thought about any advocacy and the ramifications of it going digital. So I use that hook to get in, but I think it's super problematic with the political communications audience and people like Dave who've got a much more sophisticated understanding of the different digital eras through time and the different kinds of interest groups and advocacy. So I think there's a huge hungry need for more work, which is a nice note to end on.
Yeah. So let's end there, but I also want to end by once again saying Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Age. Excellent book. If you have not bought it yet, buy it. And then be at something in person with Nina so that you can get her to sign it. Nina, next time I see you.
You're welcome all in Bologna. There's love to see you here. If not here, then I hope to see you somewhere else soon. Thanks for coming along all, and thanks Dave for hosting, and for Elisa who was in the background doing all the wonderful organizing for the team. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nina.